I'm Dr. Ken Landau. Thanks for watching. Let's talk about sarin. Sarin is a weapon of mass destruction. It's in the news because the Syrian government released it against its own people in the Idlib province, April 4, 2017. Fixed-wing aircraft released projectiles that contained the sarin, and as a result, somewhere between 86 and 150 people died, 300 people were injured. Government said, we didn't do it. Not us, but some of the people were autopsied in Turkey, and it was found at the Forensic Medical Institute with the World Health Organization present that, yes, indeed, sarin was the responsible agent. Well, earlier in the Syrian war against its own insurgents, there had been talk that the Syrian government was going to use these chemicals of mass destruction, or weapons of mass destruction. That led to Obama's famous red line. But it didn't do much good because in the Ghouta region in 2013, they released some sarin. And as a result, somewhere between 320 and 1,730 people died. Well, there wasn't a war between the Allies and Syria because Putin from Russia brokered a deal where the Syrian government would release all of their chemical weapons, including sarin, to a consortium that would then destroy them. Well, they had a lot of these weapons of mass destruction. It was estimated that Syria had one of the largest collections of these agents, including sarin and VX, including mustard gas, including the precursor chemicals. Well, supposedly they were going to release all of these agents ultimately to the Norwegians and the Danes, who were going to take them to sea to an American vessel called the Cape Ray that was going to incinerate them. And indeed, it was done, at least according to members of the Obama administration, and Secretary of State at the time, John Kerry, said all of the weapons and all of the components have been destroyed, but the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons found subsequently traces of VX and traces of sarin. So they evidently weren't all released. Now, there's a lot of talk about whether it was really the Syrian government that did it, or whether it was al-Nusra, or whether it was al-Qaeda, or whether it was a result of a secret agreement between the Qataris and the Saudis and the Turks, and maybe participation of the United States government. Lots of talk about all of this. Don't know what the answer is. However, we do know that sarin was indeed used. Now, we have a lot of these toxic agents. We have choking agents like chlorine. We have the blistering agents like different kind of mustards, nitrogen mustard or sulfur mustard or lewisite. We have the blood agents like the hydrogen cyanide. We have nerve agents like tabin. We also have VX and sarin. And we have the riot control agents. Now, sarin, or German agent B, or simply GB, is colorless, odorless, tasteless. It's a nerve agent, a weapon of mass destruction, of course. It's the most volatile of all of the nerve agents, and it can evaporate from a liquid into a vapor stage. It's man-made. It's not made in nature. It's highly toxic. It's estimated that it's about 550-fold more deadly than chlorine, anywhere between 30 and 80-fold more deadly than cyanide. Actually, sarin is an acronym for the names of the people who were involved in its early production. The inventor, Gerhard Schroeder, that's the S, then Ambrose and Ritter and von der Linden make up the rest. Actually, Ambrose was tried in the Nuremberg trials in 1948, convicted of war crimes, sentenced to 8 years in prison, but after only 4 years was brought to America to work on our chemical weapons program. Sarin is an orthophosphate. It's basically an insecticide. It's like malathion on steroids, but it can be lethal at even a single drop. A drop on the skin. Within 1 to 10 minutes, you can suffer a lethal muscle paralysis unless you get the antidote. The antidote is a shot of atropine and another shot of something called pralidoxime. If you're exposed to a non-lethal amount and you live for more than 20 minutes, then chances are you'll be okay. But it might have some residual toxicity to either the brain or the nerves. The chemical is easily broken down, unlike VX. Easily broken down by rain or water or sweat or hydrogen peroxide or in a very alkaline, high pH environment. There are several different methods to manufacture the product, but all of them contain a lot of impurities. There are a lot of acids that are produced. There's hydrochloric acid and hydrofluoric acid are the two major ones, and that means that they break down very readily. So you have to stabilize the chemical. You can't store it for long periods of time. There's a breakdown product that is measured. It's called IMPA. It stands for isopropyl, like alcohol, methylphosphonic acid. So IMPA, it only basically comes from sarin, nothing else. Then we have a lot of other products that come from any of the ortho or organophosphates. Why is there a problem with this agent? There's a problem with this agent, with sarin, because it interferes with a chemical that's necessary to relax the muscles. So when a nerve releases a chemical known as acetylcholine that stimulates the muscle to contract, the way your body works is that acetylcholine has to be broken down very quickly. And then more is formed and it's broken down. So basically we have an alternating current or cycle that occurs. In the absence of the cycle, in the continued stimulation of the muscle, then we get the spasm and all of the problems with this kind of a nerve agent, whether we're talking about the tabin, whether we're talking about the VX or the sarin. Now the shelf life of the sarin is only several weeks to several months. If we increase its purity, we put some stabilizers in, we might be able to get a maximum shelf life of about 5 years. But in Iraq and Syria, the half-life is only weeks unless we don't continue through for the full reaction. We carry the two separate vials and then at the last minute combine those two vials. Well, we know that the liquid evaporates at a temperature of about 150 degrees Celsius. So that means when it's detonated with a bomb, it causes the liquid to become gaseous, and that can penetrate through the skin, through the eye, get on the surface of your clothes, can last on your clothing for about 30 minutes, can expose other people if they touch your clothes, or if you pull your clothes over your head, you can further increase the amount that you're exposed to. The toxic reaction occurs either through the skin or through the eye, or breathing it actually can get on the food, and you can have gastrointestinal toxicity, or it can get on the water, and then you drink it, and that's a problem, obviously, also. Well, in wartime, it's usually dispersed in missiles or rockets where we have clouds of droplets that people inhale. The symptoms associated with sarin are pretty unique. Starts off with a runny nose, then your eyes become irritated, your vision becomes blurred, your pupils become very constricted just to pinpoints. And as a result of the stimulation of the muscles inside the eyes hurt. And then you sweat, your chest becomes very tight. You have a frothy foam coming from the mouth that's oftentimes tinged with blood from the lungs. You have difficulty breathing and you start coughing. And then there's nausea and drooling. You lose control of your bodily functions. So you urinate, defecate, you vomit. People become confused and drowsy and weak. They develop headache. The heart rate, the blood pressure can either go up or go down. Ultimately, there's loss of consciousness, respiratory failure, paralysis because the muscles stop working. You can develop some convulsions, some shaking, some twitching, some jerking. We refer to this as the sludge. That's another one of those acronyms. Sludge, S-L-U-D-G-E, stands for salivation, excessive saliva, lacrimation, your eyes water, urination. You can have defecation, gastrointestinal distress, and emesis, or vomiting. Or we call it the killer bees. Killer bees, bronchorrhea, lots of fluid forms inside the lungs. The muscles go into spasm, bronchospasm, and you die because you don't get any air in. And that's all because we block the chemical that's necessary for the muscles and the glands to relax. The toxicity varies with the amount you're exposed to, how long you're exposed to it, and how you're exposed to it. Is it the skin or is it through the respiratory system? Well, if it's the respiratory system in a vapor, you can develop the symptoms within several seconds. It can be up to a minute if it happens to get on your skin. The antidotes are available, but the first thing you have to do, when exposed to the chemical, you get out of the area, you get into some fresh air. If you were exposed in a building, get the heck out, get the clothes off. Don't pull them over the head because you don't want to contaminate the eyes, the nose, the mouth. So cut the clothes off if it's necessary. Put them in a plastic bag and put the plastic bag in another plastic bag. Wash your skin with soap and water, and if you have any visual symptoms, burning in your eyes or blurring of your eyes, wash your eyes for about 10 to 15 minutes. The antidote is atropine, but atropine only works on some of the physiologic symptoms, does not work on the muscles themselves. For the muscles, you need another kind of a chemical called pralidoxime. Now they're working on another kind of a chemical called biparidin. Biparidin is usually used for Parkinson's disease. The World Health Organization says it's an essential medicine. It crosses the blood-brain barrier somewhat easily, more easily so than the other chemicals we use. Military forces are given a combination of atropine and pralidoxime in self-injectors should they need them, and the military is working on a reactive skin decontamination lotion. Well, if you live for more than 20 minutes, chances are you're not going to die, but you might have some long-lasting sequelae that affects the brain or affects the nerve. The chemical was discovered in Germany in the 1930s. Actually, it was discovered at IG Farben, which was a division of Bayer Chemicals, Bayer aspirin. Well, Gerhard Schroeder was a chemist. He was only 33 at the time, and he was working as the head of the plant protection unit. They had a major problem in Germany during the war. They had a problem with weevils. They were overrun by weevils, and they couldn't kill them. So they needed a better pesticide. He was working on developing a better pesticide that would kill the pests and not harm animals or harm people. The first chemical that he developed was called, ultimately, tabun, T-A-B-U-N. He discovered that when he mixed some cyanide with chemicals he was working on, and within seconds he developed a splitting headache, he struggled to breathe, he could hardly see, he had pinpoint pupils, and it took him 3 weeks to recover. But because it was the war, the formula was given immediately to the German Army weapons unit. They evaluated the chemical and said, oh my goodness, we can use this in the war. They named tabun. That means, in German, taboo. They gave Schroeder a bonus, although he thought he failed because he was working on a pesticide. So he went back to the laboratory, and now he was working on a more serious kind of toxin. He developed the Sarin. Unfortunately, this weapon of mass destruction, 10 times more potent than the tabun, was going to be used in World War II against the Allies. Actually, they were building a facility just to manufacture it in 1943. They had incorporated some of the material into artillery shells, but they never used them. They never used them because Hitler had been gassed in World War I, and he remembered what it was like. And he thought that if he used these kind of drugs, that the Allies probably had similar drugs. He was told that they did, although the drugs he didn't know at the time were not nearly as potent as the sarin. Well, let's go back and talk about chemicals of mass destruction. The first treaty, or the first agreement, was between the French and the Holy Roman Empire way back in 1675, when in Strasbourg they agreed that they weren't going to use any bullets dipped in poison. More recently, 1899, the Hague Declaration, even though there was no problem, 32 countries got together and said, we will not use projectiles, the principal purpose of which is diffusing, asphyxiating, or toxic gases. That was 1899. 1907, they had a follow-up agreement. Then we had World War I. And what happened in World War I? Well, over 10 million people died, 20 million people injured, and probably about 90,000 soldiers were killed because of chemicals of mass destruction, of war-related chemicals. Now, even though that accounts for less than 2% of all of the injuries, less than 1% of all of the fatalities, there was international revulsion that anybody would ever use these kind of chemicals. Actually, the first large-scale chemical attack was against the Allies in Belgium. And that was in April of 1915, when they used hundreds of tons of chlorine and ended up killing somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 Allied troops. Well, that led, after the war, after World War I, to the Geneva Protocol of 1925 that was effective in 1928. And what happened is, they said, and Syria was a signatory to this, that there would be no use of chemical or biological weapons, that didn't prohibit the development, the production, or the stockpilings of these weapons of mass destruction. It just prevented the use. And then further on, in 1975, they had a biologic weapons convention that banned the use of biologic weapons. Everything was combined later on, but World War II intervened. And what happened in World War II? Well, started off with 1935, Mussolini gassing the Abyssinians. That's now Ethiopia. About 15,000 people died. Japan used toxic, now called weapons of mass destruction, at least 2,000 times against the Chinese. They finally stopped when Roosevelt said, hey, you guys are going to suffer massive consequences unless you knock this nonsense off. Actually, Roosevelt rejected the use of these chemicals before the attack at Iwo Jima. Now, different story in England, in 1944, Churchill actually wanted to use weapons of mass destruction against the Germans, but his military advisors said absolutely no. And as I said, that Hitler rejected the use in war, but he did use these kind of toxins against the Jews, against the Gypsies, and against others. Well, in the 1950s, Sarin was considered a standard agent in NATO. It was accepted as a chemical of mass destruction. The United States, and at that time the USSR, started manufacturing these. Actually, a fatality occurred at Porton-Down, the chemical warfare testing facility at Wiltshire, England, where they actually had a volunteer who was in the Royal Air Force, and they dropped several drops of sarin on his clothing and skin. He died. It took him about 40 years to fess up to that. We had another problem just in Utah at the Dugway Proving Ground, where in 1952, some planes that were testing sarin unfortunately dropped the 100-gallon jugs off of the wings, spread to an area of about 38,000 square feet on the ground, and unfortunately, an inspection crew was sent. Everybody wore gas masks except one person. He got out of the ambulance that they were sent in. He was a 32-year-old gentleman, and within 10 seconds he was clutching his chest. He stumbled back to the ambulance. Even though he was given an antidote, he suffered convulsions. He had flaccid paralysis and spasms. He was hospitalized with an iron lung, and fortunately he survived. These toxins were again used in 1966, 1967 by Nasser in Egypt, intermittently in the Yemen War, 1976. Chile used them, the government, for political assassinations. And then we get to the real modern era, Saddam Hussein. Hussein used them at least 4 times against the Iranians in the Iraq-Iran war. Tens of thousands of people died, but nobody seemed to care until he released some of these same chemicals against the Kurdish population in the northern Iraqi city of Halabja. 5,000 people were killed, and instantly there was international condemnation. That led to the 1993 Chemical Weapons Convention. That was signed by 189 nations. That banned the stockpiling, banned the production, banned all of these weapons. It was going to take effect in 1997, and by 2007, all of these agents were to be destroyed. That means that there were somewhere around 30 million pounds of these chemicals that were going to be destroyed, and up until recently, we've still had at least 11% of all of the chemicals there, and in fact, in the United States, it's said that the complete destruction isn't going to occur until about 2023. Well, the Chemical Weapons Convention came with an organization, the implementing body, and that's the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Now, it's headquartered at The Hague. It's based on the Rome Statute that set up the International Criminal Court. And if a person or if a government uses these chemicals, that is considered a war crime. But there are 5 countries that are not party to this agreement. Syria is one of them, of course. So is Egypt, Angola, South Sudan, and North Korea, that has an estimated 5 million to 10 million pounds of a variety of these lethal weapons. Now, all of the previous attacks and previous use of weapons of mass destruction have been used by governments until 1994 at the Matsumoto in Nagano province in Japan, where a group known as Aum Shinrikyo released some sarin, and as a result, 8 people died and some 200 were injured. The next year, 1995, that's the famous occurrence, when they attacked the Tokyo subway. They did that to forestall a police raid on their headquarters. 12 people died, somewhere around 5,500, mostly worried well, sought medical care. Now, in Rwanda, tens of thousands of people died because of machetes. Nobody is anti-machete. In Syria, it's estimated 400,000 people died of conventional weapons, shrugged off by international authorities. Relatively few people have been injured or killed by poison gas, but that led to international damnation. So unfortunately, we can impose bans, but if we have these rogue nations, they're not necessarily going to follow the agreements that they sign. And unfortunately, with the framework that we have at the United Nations, which is the central body, we can't get China and the United States and Russia on the same side all the time, so we can't have any sanctions. That led to Trump sending those tomahawks in April of 2017 against Syria. Well, what can we do? Unfortunately, there seems to be relatively little we can do. We have the problem with the governments having some of these agents, and we have the rogue governments with all of these agents that have been around for so long. And even though they're difficult to manufacture, Aum Shinrikyo just hired a chemist. And within a very short time of that chemist hiring on, he was able to make the sarin. None of these chemicals are extremely difficult to manufacture. They are, however, highly lethal. Unfortunately, I'm sure there will be more to this story. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'm Dr. Ken Landau.